Hi, this is the MTX8 from Future Sound Systems. It's an analog switch or routing matrix for audio and control voltage. It has 8 quarter-inch inputs and 8 quarter-inch outputs. There's a version with a tube screamer-like preamp on input 1, and you use pins to route the inputs to the outputs. In this video, I'll take a look at how it works, what makes it special, and a few patch ideas, as well as how it compares to other routing solutions available on the market. Let's start with an overview. Like I mentioned, MTX8 has 8 quarter-inch inputs. There are 4 inputs on each side, and they're labeled 1 through 4 and 5 through 8. And there are 8 outputs, 4 on top, A through D, and 4 on the bottom, E through H. All of the inputs and the outputs are unbalanced. There are 2 versions of the MTX8, either with or without a single tube screamer-like preamp and overdrive or analog clipping circuit on input number 1. If you get the version with the preamp, it'll have gain, tone, and level knobs on the left, as well as a clip switch to turn the clipping circuit on or off. I'll test this both with a guitar and a synth in a bit. Input number 1 in the preamp version of MTX8 also has an overall high-pass filter applied to it, starting at about 200 Hz with a gentle 3 dB per octave slope. So if you've got a bass-heavy instrument, you'll want to use inputs 2 through 8. The build seems pretty solid with very little give. It's made of a laminated material that seems robust. There's a video of the folks at Future Sound Systems stepping on it on their Facebook page, so presumably it can withstand a bit of stomping. The actual circuit in the middle is clearly inspired by the EMS Synthy. If you're not familiar with the concept, it's pretty simple. You connect an input to an output by placing a pin where they intersect on the matrix. So for example, if I wanted to connect the guitar to line output number 1, I'd place a pin here. If I wanted to connect line 4, the line 4 input into the output, I'd place a pin here. The beauty of the way this matrix works, other than it's very visual, is that there's no limit to the number of outputs that you can send an input to, or the number of inputs that you can combine into a single output. So you could route everything to everything here in a single chain, or you could make a few parallel chains, or you could make a chain that starts and splits up into 2 or combines into 1. Once again, more examples coming in a bit. The only limit is the number of pins you have. This comes with 10, but you can buy more if you want. If you want to complicate this simple concept a bit, you can think of it like a combination of 8 buffered splitters or multiples on the input sides and 8 mixers on the output side, 1 mixer for each and every one of the 8 outputs. It also comes with a dry wipe marker. This is all laminated, so you can scribble anywhere you want. You could scribble on the inputs on either side and on the outputs on either side. I prefer to write everything here on the left and outputs here on top. I think that's more intuitive, and this erases pretty easily. The MTX8 does require power. It's 9-volt center negative like all the other pedals, so you can run it on your main pedal board power supply if you have a good one, but it also comes with its own power supply. So what's the point of all this? The idea is that once you connect all your pedals or instruments or whatever you have coming and going to this is your central hub for making the connections between everything. You connect them to each other using the matrix rather than moving them around or unplugging cables and replugging them back in every time you want to change something. This is fully analog. There's no digital to analog conversion. When you bypass a pedal, it is of course true bypass because it's literally not in the chain. As far as I tested, I couldn't hear any bleed, noise, or interference between the channels. So that's it for the overview. There are no menus or hidden options. What you see is what you get. Let's take a look at the preamp and then a few patch ideas. So I'll grab the guitar. My guitar is already plugged in to input 1, but I do need to still route it to one of the outputs that are connected to my audio interface, which is output 1 and output 2 over here. I'll just take one of the pins, plug the guitar into output 1, and we can already hear it. Gain is all the way down, and tone is around the middle, so is level. This is what it sounds like with a pick. Let's maybe increase the gain a bit, reduce level. And clipping is where it gets more interesting. Over here, let's turn on clipping. Now, I'm not running this through an amp or amp simulator, so you're hearing the raw tone coming out of the clipping circuit. This is what it sounds like with chords. As you can clearly hear, this is no guitar channel, but hopefully you get an idea for what the clipping sounds like. We'll get back to the guitar in a bit. Let's try out what this sounds like on a synth. So I'll turn clipping off, put tone, say somewhere in the middle, and level in the middle. Now my synth is plugged in both to input 1 and to input 4 here, so the raw sound sounds like this. And if I plug it through the preamp, you can hear the high-pass filter. Back through the high-pass, let's take a listen to it with the clipping circuit. Let's just play around with a few levels to give you an idea of the character of a synth going through the preamp. So the clipping circuit certainly gives this a different character. So that's the preamp on synths. I'll venture out of my comfort zone and get back to using a guitar on this. Let's take a look at a few more of the basics before we look at some advanced patch ideas. In terms of connecting to MTX8, it's not rocket science. Pedal or instrument outputs go into the inputs on either side, and then the outputs go either back into the inputs of the different pedals or out to the inputs of your audio interface or mixer. You can also use the MTX8 with modular or semi-modular gear, meaning to patch through this patch matrix, you just need 8-inch to 1/4-inch adapters like this one. You'll need quite a few of them because you'll need to go from the outputs to the inputs and then from the outputs here to the inputs on your modular system. That said, for a Eurorack setup, you're probably better off just getting the MTX9, which is much cheaper than this and comes in both a passive and active option and won't require special patch cables. The order of the inputs and outputs doesn't matter. You don't even have to connect both the input and the output of a pedal to this. I've got, for example, both inputs of Poly connected to outputs E and F over here, and both the outputs connected to inputs 7 and 8 on the matrix. Each of the inputs and outputs is mono, like I mentioned earlier, unbalanced, so while you can work in stereo, it'll cost you 2 inputs and 2 outputs for every part of your chain that's in stereo. So let's take a look at a few sample chains, and I will get back to the guitar. So let's say that I wanted to add reverb to the guitar. Now, when using guitar effects, if they have a dry-wet mix control, you don't need to connect the guitar to your output as well, right? So I don't need to connect the guitar here. I can go through Poly's input number 1, which is what I have the reverb connected to, then take the output of Polychain 1, and connect that to my audio interface. And I get Poly's version of a Lexicon 480 reverb. Now this pedal from PolyEffects actually has 4 inputs and 4 outputs, so it can be a little mini matrix on its own, but a matrix of 4x4 isn't that useful. What makes this more interesting is the sheer number of effects and synth engines it has. Anyway, that's how you can connect a single pedal into the chain, guitar going into Poly 1 going out to the audio interface. What if I wanted to add another pedal into the chain, let's say KFM? So I would take the guitar, unplug it here, plug it into KFM, right, guitar into KFM, and then take the output of KFM and connect that to Poly 1. So we're sort of going around in circles here. Guitar to KFM, KFM to Poly 1 to the output. KFM can do quite a few things. The lovely thing it does here is a subtle pitch modulation, sort of like a random pitch shift. Let's say we choose a slightly more subtle reverb here. Let's go for a medium hall. Okay. Now the beauty of this is that you can experiment with different routings without unplugging a single cable. So SY1 is sort of like a guitar to synth engine, and Blooper is a looper. It matters whether I put this before this or this after this. So if I want to put Blooper before SY1, I'd go from the guitar into the input of Blooper, then route the output of Blooper into, say, Poly 1. I don't need KFM in this case, and then I can go from Poly 1 directly to the output. So this is just Blooper in the chain. I could then record whatever I wanted, loop it, and mess around with it the way Blooper knows. And then if I wanted to feed that into SY1, then I'd need to take the output of Blooper, plug that into SY1, and then the output of SY1 into Poly 1. And Poly 1 is already going out to my audio interface. So if I just loop the raw audio, this is why guitarists need foot switches. It's the first part of my loop, and then maybe add this and loop back, which will be a bit abrupt because I started this in the middle. Anyway, now this is looping the raw audio. I can bring in SY1 to turn this into this crazy arpeggiated pattern. And the nice thing about the way that this works is if I now repitch this, it'll obviously repitch the arpeggiated pattern as well. So the idea here was just to show that I can route things any way I want. Obviously, Blooper after SY1 would sound completely different. Now, I could go ahead and create a completely different parallel chain. So I could mix in the synth, again, to the same output or to a different output. Let's just plug it into the same one and play the synth over here. And this chain runs completely in parallel to this one. I could also create a completely parallel chain with the same source. So let's say that I wanted to plug the guitar alongside Blooper into Plasma Coil here. And then I want to go ahead and mix that into the output as well. So I'll take the output of Plasma, plug that into output 1. Now Plasma Coil is a pretty wild pedal, but it does have volume control. So I could mix it in any way I wanted, either nothing or gradually bring it in. Yeah, change its sensitivity, by the way. And the point here is to show that you can have these multiple chains going in parallel. Now you can keep on layering things. So let's say that I wanted to bring the synth into this madness. I could take the synth, which is plugged into also into line input 4, plug that into the same output, so I could mix 3 things if I wanted into here. So we should hear the synth. So obviously I don't have enough hands for this setup, but I could pluck this string and then play the synth in parallel. I would obviously need to manage gain levels for all this madness. Let's put the guitar back and take a look at pros and cons. So the promise of a system like this is that you connect everything to it and then you never have to plug or unplug anything to it. This obviously isn't the only solution for that kind of problem out there on the market. Alternatives range from simple patch bays all the way to fully automated switches. Aside from simple patch bays that obviously don't give you this kind of flexibility, there's a whole category of switch pedals like the Boss ES5 or ES8 or the Gigrig G2 that can act as a central hub for multiple pedals or instruments. They're mainly intended for creating a single chain rather than freeform multiple parallel chains, though they do have some parallel functionality. I couldn't find a fully flexible routing solution though similar to this where any one of the inputs can be routed to any one of the outputs at the same time, except for the much more expensive Switchblade from Sound Sculpture, which has more features but is menu driven. I've not tried it. If you're familiar with other solutions, feel free to leave a comment below. There are also several audio interfaces that have matrix-style switches in their software control centers. That obviously requires having a computer and using it, and isn't as simple and straightforward as routing pins like this. It's beyond the scope of this video to make a full comparison to all those other products. I'll expand more on that in my book as I explore different options in this area because it's certainly interesting. But in general, these other systems may have built-in digital effects. MTX8 has no effects other than the drive or clipping on input 1 or additional perks like MIDI and foot switch controls. But perhaps more importantly, they can save routings as presets, something you can't do here. Not that it's that big of a deal to move these pins around, but it's not something you can do with your feet in the middle of a show unless you plan to play barefoot and have serious toe dexterity. Another con compared to some of the other options, other than level control on input 1, if you get the preamp model of MTX8, there's no level control for the inputs, matrix points, or on the outputs. So you'll need to control levels in the audio outputs of the instruments coming into the inputs, or have some sort of input gain control wherever the outputs are going in. I know the pins have different colors, but they're all identical, so there's no option to attenuate the signal differently using different resistance pins like on the EMS Synthy. So once a signal goes in, it's at the same level for any of the outputs that you route it to. On the pros side, MTX8 is light, small, and very easy and straightforward to use. There are no menus to dive through to create routings, and it's very clear to see what's going on. You do need to get used to the concept of this circular routing going in and out, but once you do, it's both a desktop patch bay and a fully flexible switchboard, and does both jobs in a very easy and intuitive way. The preamp option is fun and works well both for guitars and synths, and having a pedal setup ready to go and never needing to rewire it with the option to easily route anything to everything is extremely useful and way more conducive to experimentation than rewiring your pedals all the time, not to mention the option to split into parallel chains or to merge chains whenever you want. The MTX8 isn't cheap. It costs like a high-end pedal, so it's probably overkill if you only have 2 or 3 effects pedals, but if you have more, this is a great way to explore them and make sure that they're easily accessible when you need them and out of the way when you don't. I can already see myself wanting something like this as a hub for an even larger setup, so hopefully in the future we'll get maybe a 10x10 or 16x16 version of this. So that's it for MTX8. If you found the insights in this video useful, there's plenty more of them in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. And like I mentioned, I'll dedicate a chapter to solutions like this. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.